Thanks for listening to Cool Meanderings with Dr. Germ G. Welcome back to Cool Meanderings with Dr. Germ G. The delirium is beginning to settle in. The New York Knicks, after 27 years, are heading back to the NBA Finals after a Game 4 dismantling of the Cleveland Cavaliers, 130-93, a sweep, 11 playoff wins in a row. I can't believe it. I've been a long time New York Knicks fan, going back to the early 80s, and I'm stunned, as are many longtime Knicks fans. But that's not why I'm on the podcast right now. I wanted to hop on to just give some thoughts on a groundswell of stories that I keep seeing related to higher education, particularly here in the U.S., but it looks like this is becoming a trend in other countries too, like the United Kingdom. But here in the U.S., it seems like there's some serious headwinds that I've talked about in the past, but lately it just seems that there seems to be just a convergence of different challenges all coming at one time to create a perfect storm. And just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, so I think one thing that's I think become an increasing issue is just a general perception of the college degree. There seems to be more articles and videos and just conversations with people just discussing the purpose and value of a college degree. Lots of questioning about what, just is a college degree worth it at this point? And, should I pursue a college degree? What will a college degree give me in terms of return on investment? These are all very good questions. But it just seems like that's become so much of a recurring theme that you have to wonder, wow, how big of a problem is it? And then obviously there's a decline in political support for the current model of higher education in the U.S. And examples of that would be all the federal funding cuts for higher ed, particularly among the elite universities that have super low acceptance rates. The universities like the Ivy Leagues or the public and privates that are just as competitive as the Ivy Leagues, that have really dominated in terms of federal research dollars for decades. And, the cachet that comes with that. A lot of that money has gone away, since we've had the Trump administration part 2 in 2025. Lots of cuts that appear to be making an impact on enrollments. For example, MIT is experiencing a drop in graduate enrollment, in part because for some of their programs, due to the federal funding cuts, can't quite support as many graduate students. But there's also pressure at the state level. There's some states, particularly in the South Midwest, that are challenging the current models for higher education, particularly from their publicly funded universities. This isn't necessarily a terrible thing. I think you want to have some oversight for your publicly funded universities. But again, it seems that these things are all happening in concert. But here's something else that I wanted to point out. These are regional accreditations that most four-year public and private universities have, they follow, right? And these accreditations allow the universities to have the credibility to receive federal support and they're, they're in the form of not only grant money, but I believe it also enables institutions to offer federal financial aid. So there is a purpose to the regional accreditation standards that currently exist. Well, even those are under pressure. They're being challenged by not only by politicians at the state level, but also at the federal level. So apparently we can expect some changes that will impact accrediting bodies, higher ed accrediting bodies across the country. We can expect that later in the year, some guidance from the Department of Education, right? So there's that. So that's like sort of the bigger things, like examples of some of the bigger things that are affecting higher ed. But while that's happening, you have more, I would say, material examples of challenges like decline in international student enrollment, which has been going on now for a couple of years. Well, everyone had, most institutions had a drop of enrollment during the COVID pandemic, but there was a bounce back, I would say, for maybe 1 or 2 academic years. But since 2024, 2025, around 2025, we've seen a consistent drop in international student enrollment. And I know that, there's been a ton of research out there that has demonstrated the real impact on not only the universities and colleges and universities that host these international students, but the local economies that these universities, these institutions feed into. The impact from international students is real. And so the fact that we've had steady declines means that there's a real negative impact for not only for those institutions, but subsequently for those communities that are affected by the institutions. The presence of students who, domestic and international, that contribute to the growth of those institutions, the growth of those economies. So there's that. That's a real issue. I think like a tangible issue. Another tangible issue is just the overall decline in student enrollment. And this has been talked about too. It's been projected for a while that we'd have a smaller contingent of 18-year-olds, in part because of what happened during the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crisis in the late 2000s, between 2006 or 7 through 2010. Essentially, people had less kids. And that cohort is now, they're now beginning to go to college. I actually have one that's coming up in another year. So I can attest to this firsthand. Yeah. I can attest to, I have someone that's in that cohort. I can't say from my own experience that I'm seeing. Well, maybe a little bit. But I haven't followed this research that carefully myself. But from what I've read and observed, it is a real data point. Clearly, universities are feeling it. Colleges and universities are feeling it because they're sounding the alarm. They're trying to brace for impact, what it means for, future expenses, future cost. But speaking of cost, in addition to the declining enrollment because of the sort of drop in demographics, cost concerns are real for a lot of students. So part of it is, sure, there's a demographic shift, okay? But part of it is, hey, those students that can go may not necessarily want to go because they don't want to pay $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year, or maybe their parents don't want to pay it. So there's that too. And one reason might be, and this is another real data point, is that there seems to be increasing concern about job outcomes for recent graduates. I don't know. I feel like this is, regardless of data points, this has always been sort of a concern as the economy changes and we go through different growth, and evolutions of technology. We had the dot-com bubble at the end of the 90s into the early 2000s. This is the next iteration with, artificial intelligence or this version of artificial intelligence that we're experiencing now. But there are data points out that suggest that even at the top tier institutions, the most selective institutions, they're not necessarily having 90 plus employment for their recent graduates, 90+% employment, meaning that the vast majority of their graduates are finding employment immediately. Even at that level, it's not the case. So you can imagine what the challenges are for graduates of mid-tier public universities or God forbid, these nonprofit private universities where students are really paying, hefty price tag for an okay college experience or should I say okay college degree. Maybe they've had a great 4-year or 5-year college experience being on campus, but the quality of the degree itself is mid. It's probably okay. And that's all right. Listen, students should go where they want to go. Obviously they should understand what they're getting into. Some do, and some, are fine with figuring it out later. That's cool. But if we're talking about outcomes, job outcomes for recent grads, if you have grads from Harvard and Penn and Yale that are struggling to find gigs, and their employment success for recent grads isn't like 95% and up. If it's in the 80s, that level, one can only imagine. That's my point. So you've got that issue, right? And then you've got another issue for higher ed is, and this has just been quietly building, but there is a, how would you call it? There is a restructuring movement happening with colleges, universities in the country. And what I mean by that is you have institutions of different types that are either closing or merging. And you also have lots of discussions, public discussions, and in some cases, inactions of personnel layoffs. Whether we're talking about, liberal arts colleges to public flagship universities. I recently read an article that listed at least 5 or 6 public flagship universities that were dealing with potential personnel layoffs due to budgetary challenges, due to forecasting of future budget shortfalls. Well, existing and future budget shortfalls at public flagship universities. These are essentially like the main public universities at the state level. These are your, examples would be like your University of Virginia, University of Maryland, College Park, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, University of Colorado, Boulder, University of Texas at Austin, like your major public universities, University of Michigan, University of Oregon. So at that level, you've got challenges. And I don't say obvious, but, if the challenges are happening at the top tier public institution level, you can only assume that these challenges are trickling down to other types of institutions. And there's evidence to suggest that this is the case. So you've got that going on. And then you've got a phenomenon I've actually talked about briefly on my YouTube channel. I actually put up a AI generated video about degree hacking. I mean, I did the research, but like I had an automated voice, just give a automated voiceover, just highlighting the whole point of their degree hacking. But essentially, it's about, in my view, it's about learners finding the fast track options to get a degree. So instead of spending 4 to 5 years to get a bachelor's degree, maybe you find a program that helps you get that degree in 2 or 3 years. Well, apparently a lot of, different types of, 4-year or even graduate institutions are looking at degree models that reduce the amount of time that students need to stay on campus. One that seems to be popular is the 3-year bachelor's degree. And I think another one is sort of a 3 and 2, where like if you do 5 years, you get both a bachelor's degree and master's degree. So it's like a 3+2. The 3+2 though, I think has been around for a while, but the 3-year bachelor's degree seems to be a sticking point now because it's getting traction at a lot of different universities, and quite frankly, it's understandable. I mean, these are institutions that are responding to their students. They're responding to the market. They're responding to the reality that, hey, people want to get out there, get their credentials, get out there and position themselves for a market that is changing quickly. Completely understandable. And part of the reason why it's changing is because of the advancements of technology, right? Everyone's, concerned or excited or confused about the seemingly rapid advances of artificial intelligence. Now, yes, from a career or professional standpoint, yeah, I mean, that's a big challenge. But what about the influence of this technology on learning on both college campuses and at the K through 12 level? And I reference the K through 12 level because, hey, these are the people that are eventually making it to these college campuses. And I think there's a real question, that perhaps isn't getting enough attention. How much is the use or the reliance on AI affecting the capacity of students to learn, to demonstrate that they understand what it is that they're learning? Right now, you can see there are quite a few examples of professors that are shifting their teaching and learning strategies to more oral presentations, oral exams, oral analyses, basically, putting the onus on the student to be able to articulate their understanding of things that they're reading or presumably reading and studying, as opposed to just simply relying on what it is that they put on the screen or paper, because it's clearly become relatively easy to rely on AI to generate the kind of content that they think that the student thinks would be acceptable for their professors. And so also it's a tricky one. But I think too, we have to look at what's happening at the K through 12 level, where there's, you could argue, less oversight because, listen, K through 12 education is very much localized. It's all about what's happening in specific districts. And, that's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, sure, because it's localized, it's about the local participation, the people that are there. But at the same time, the people that are there, they may be complacent, right? And they may not have incentive to provide the kind of oversight of the use of AI that may be needed, right? But listen, K through 12 education is a rabbit hole that I'm not going to get into on this podcast. I'll just say that I will posit that, there are quite a few challenges with students that are using or misusing that technology to maybe get assignments done that they don't necessarily understand. And at some point along the way, for some kids, tragically, it doesn't come until after they graduate from K through 12 education that it's discovered that these kids don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're reading. They don't understand how to read. And it's not just a matter of testing data. If you want to rely on, test data like SAT scores or, standardized, tests for reading and things like that, sure, you can make that argument. But there's more material evidence or anecdotal evidence from college instructors that would suggest that, whether it's, existing gaps in learning prior to sort of the emphasis on AI or the combination of the two, clearly there's something happening. So you have that going on too. You have the influence of AI on college campuses in K through 12 education. Is just a general concern about students' capacity to actually understand what it is that they're studying, especially given the amount of investment that families are being asked to make to get said degree. Ideally, you would want, as institutions, you want to make sure that the students are at the very least capable of understanding what it is that they're investing in. But anyway, so you've got that. And, I would be remiss if I didn't mention also inflation. The cost of everything. The cost of everything from fuel to food to energy, it's gone up. Just an overarching increase in the cost of living, depending on where you are, has gone up. And that too has an impact on the attitudes or the sentiments of education. How much of an investment makes sense. And so you have all that going on. And I'm sure there are things that I haven't mentioned here. I'm just giving you sort of an overview of what I'm observing and what I've been observing and sort of mulling on. But I just thought it'd be good to just, give some thoughts on where I see all this going. And the reason why I feel compelled to do so is because I've been in this field for so long. As I've mentioned before, I'm an educator, aspiring writer, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, I am knee deep in the stuff. I do have a PhD. My PhD is in education. I focused primarily on higher education. Specifically, I looked at how universities, colleges and universities could leverage their resources to create greater emphasis on international ties and connections across the campus, across the institution, from the mission statement to campus environment, obviously to, the teaching and learning and stuff like that. But, listen, being in that environment, you get exposed to some of these other themes that are related to the university. And one thing I would say is that from my own experience and research, I would say that this is another era of disruption and change in higher ed. What that means is that you have to go back and look at, for example, the expansion of higher education in the United States immediately after World War II in 1945. That expansion went on for about 30 years. But when you got to the mid 70s, things hit a peak, and this was a period where there was a convergence of things happening in society. At that time, the country was dealing with some instability in national leadership. You had the Watergate situation. You had uncertainty with, leadership at the executive level. You had high oil prices. In the 70s, you really started to see things like, airplanes being, hijacked, or, you had these, you had increasing violence in urban areas. And, some would argue that this was also a time where you saw, increase in drug use in certain areas. But that all coupled with a dimming of sentiment about higher ed. Higher education went through a little bit of a lull, I would say, from the late 70s until probably the early 90s. And look, I say all that to say that, hey man, there are spikes and dips in different sectors, and I think right now in higher education, we're probably in a little bit of a short or down period. I think what probably makes this a bit different is because it seems anyway that there are so many things happening at one time. But I would say that, one can be confident that the powers that be, the institutions, they'll figure it out. Yes, we're probably going to see more closures or mergers and things like that, and there'll be lots of streamlining on college campuses. Maybe, some of our, regional public universities or private institutions they'll decide to streamline some of their academic offerings. You won't have 100 different majors. Maybe you'll have campuses with 40 majors and maybe 30 minors. So it's basically we'll start to see some modifications. We'll start to see things change that in a way that's practical, in a way that begins to meet the reality of the demand, but also the changing environment outside of these campuses, right? Because they can feel like enclaves where they're sort of closed off from the reality. They're supposed to be preparing people for what's happening outside of those campuses, but at times they can begin to feel like their own little sequestered, bastion of ideas or attitudes, perspectives that might be out of touch with what's happening in the rest of the country. So, I don't know. Now, if I were a student today, if I could teleport myself, my future, my young self into the future, but keep all of my knowledge, which is not realistic, right? Then I would be creating my own version of not to get into the Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff, but I would cause some disruptions in timelines, right? And I don't want to do that. But anyway, if I could, at the very least, just have a conversation with my 18-year-old self, I would say, hey man, listen, whether you go to a 4-year or a 2-year, it doesn't really matter. What you really want to do is think about what it is that you might have an interest in. You don't necessarily have to know entirely, but think about career fields that you could see yourself potentially working in, or just think about the subjects that you gravitate towards. Maybe you're not ready to think about career fields. Just think about the subjects. Think about the subjects in school that really speak to you. Are you a person that likes English, for example? Are you a math person? Are you into the sciences? Do you dig like your, history or politics courses or things of that nature? Are you somewhere in between? Are you looking for a kind of study that combines these different fields? If that's you, then yeah, you want to think about that when you're looking at colleges, right? Think about what it is that you realistically have an interest in studying. And then from there, once you know what you want to study, then that's when you start doing the research on what it is. Well, one thing I would tell my 18-year-old self is think about the kinds of skills that you can pick up from the areas that you're interested in studying. Like, for instance, think about skills like problem solving, analyzing, communicating, being able to communicate your ideas, not just talking about your ideas, but talking about them in a persuasive manner, being able to persuade people to look at things from your point of view, whether you're trying to convince someone to take up your idea as a proposal for a project, or you're trying to sell something, you're trying to be convincing, whether it's, and that you could be convincing through the way you articulate an idea. You could be convincing through the way you project an idea if you're artistic. My point is, think about legit skills that you can learn from studying something of interest. And I think if you look at your plan, your course of study that way, you can connect the dots, right? You can connect the dots between, a specific skill that you could learn from some of your classes and how that skill is used in real life. And so I would tell my 18-year-old self to think about that. Think about that, because the reality is there's no linear path. There's no linear path, really. And this might be part of the problem. People want to take a degree and then go through a straight line from degree right into the workforce, and you have your career, or you're working in your job for 25, 30, 40 years like your parents or your grandparents. But that's just not reality. The world just doesn't work that way. Things change, and they change fast. So, 18-year-old self, you have to be adaptable. And that means that at your base level, you need a certain amount of skills that will allow you to navigate the different changes. And look, there are certain things that that you're probably going to need no matter what happens right around you, right? You're going to need to know how to communicate. You're going to need to know how to think and strategize, analyze things. You're going to have to probably understand how to deal with complex problems, right? How to solve problems, how to figure things out. These are some fundamental skills that you'll probably need. And I know, sure, there's technology that suggests you may not necessarily need to know how to write. I would beg to differ. I would say that, the technology can help you, but you still need to formulate the ideas. And you need to be able to edit, fact check, and edit any technology that you use to support your writing. So yes, you still need to know how to write. And that really is a branch of communication, right? So these are some things that I would tell my 18-year-old self. That is your base. And from there, you do your research. Do your research and figure out what those skills lead to in terms of something that you could do while you're in school, while you're studying. Make some money. Maybe you make money with an employer, with an internship. Maybe you have your own business, you know, a power washing business or a painting business, or maybe you come up with something else that's interesting that someone hasn't thought about, or maybe that someone has thought about, but there's just such a demand for it that you could easily insert yourself in. And then you don't have to make $100,000, but like, it's just, if you want to make enough money to hold you over while you're in school, that's great. Maybe help pay your tuition if you need to. That's great too. I would say, despite the challenges that some of you may be reading about in media or listening to online, this is actually a great time, a great opportunity for a creative thinker, an open-minded person, right? It's a great time in terms of going to college or going to doing some sort of post-high school study. You know, you don't necessarily have to go through a straight line. There's like, you don't have to graduate in 3 years. You don't have to graduate in 5 years. You don't have to go to a 4-year. You can take a gap year. You can take 2 gap years. You can work, you can travel. There are lots of things lots of options out there. The key is to look for them. There has to be legwork. There has to be a plan. I think I have it backwards. First, develop a plan. And that plan has to come from your curiosity, your interest, right? And then once you have the plan, and obviously the plan has to be informed by your reality. What does my reality afford me? Can I afford to take a gap year? If I go to a 2-year college, where am I going to stay? Do I have that taken care of? And if I'm using the 4-year to deal with things like housing, how can I be smart about that? Okay, yeah, I want to have independence, so I'm going to go to a 4-year. But how do I do that without creating a dependence that lasts, for most of my working life or most of my adult life, right? I mean, if you look at it, the current situation for the opportunities that are there, it's not so bad. I would tell my 18-year-old self, hey, these colleges are worried. They're worried about, if not closing, losing majors, losing departments. If I position myself well, perhaps I can get a few offers, and those offers are generous, where maybe I'm not even paying for my college. Because the reality is that most 18-year-olds are, whether it's, the students and perhaps their families, they're not doing the legwork. They're not doing the research. And I know that because I've observed and I can see how there are so many opportunities that go underutilized, unused. Scholarships. There are scholarships that programs can't give away. They can't. The universities have these wonderful activities and programs that, from my experience, have been underattended, underutilized. And look, I'll just reference my own family. I have nieces and nephews that are in college, have gone to college, and I practically had to beg them to think about taking advantage of wonderful internship opportunities, mentoring opportunities that were available. And, that I was met with, okay, in silence. And I'm like, all right, my own kid is not even interested in having conversations at times about college because of the anxiety. It's anxiety inducing. And I get that. I get it. Yeah, it's a lot to think about. But to those that are willing to think about it, to take the time to just think about it and not be afraid of what could go wrong. If you think about it and you plan it out and you embrace the fact that it might get messy and it's not a straight line, and there'll be some discomfort and you might have to tweak some things, that's okay. It's okay to tweak things. It doesn't always feel good, but it's okay. I mean, look, I'm 50-year, midlife individual, and I don't like to tweak things, but I understand. I'm still understanding that sometimes it's just the way it is. Now, obviously, at this point in my life, I'm probably a little hardened and able to embrace it more than my 18-year-old self would. That's true. But again, if I could go back to my 18-year-old self, this is what I would tell him. And to any young person that is willing and able to fight through whatever anxiety or stress or worries they have, or distractions they have, or desires to just chill, and if they can push through that enough, just to give themselves a chance to think about some fundamental things related to what they could do, I think it would be helpful. I think it'd be a helpful way to navigate what's happening, because they're clearly, listen, higher education in this country is clearly going through an overhaul. There's no doubt. The next 10 years are going to be very different for higher education. We're going to be surprised to see some creative things in some instances where, some schools will merge and some will, they'll maybe get rid of departments that have been there for a long time, and they'll do so because it's just smart business. Universities, yes, they have intrinsic value. Colleges, universities, they are dispensers of intrinsic value, right? But they're also businesses. And those that survive will act accordingly. They will figure out a way to navigate the changes and manage the duality of being a place of deep thinking and the sort of the incubating of intrinsic value, but also places that create real value, tangible, material value for their customers, their investors, their students. So, but hey, this is just one podcaster's point of view. I have a PhD, but I haven't published anything on these topics in a while. I'm just riffing here, giving you my 2 cents on what I'm seeing. So feel free to do your own research, talk to your advisors, your family members, your professors, your teachers, whomever you want, really. I would just say, if you're a parent, hey man, hang in there. And, hey, congratulations. It's really not a bad thing. If you're a parent listening to this and you're thinking about your college age kid, congratulations. You have a college age kid. That's awesome. Whether they go or not, it's up to them, but still, just to get to that point is awesome because it's not easy. And if you're someone who is studying, maybe you're 16, maybe you're 18. Hey, maybe you're 38. You're trying to transition to a new career. You know what? I didn't really talk about that, but you know what? For people that are transitioning, that's a great time too. Basically, anybody that wants to study right now, if you're smart, you won't be paying for your degree. And you'll find something that makes sense for you in terms of the time, in terms of the study, in terms of what it does for you when you're done studying. Well, thank you for allowing me to meander on that topic. If you're still listening, I appreciate your listening ear. I would love to hear from you. Drop me a line at drjermg, drjermg at coolmeanderings.com. You can also find me on YouTube, find my YouTube channel. Go ahead and like and subscribe. I'm also on Amazon Music. Man, I'm on a lot of places. My podcast is on, where is my podcast these days? I'm on Apple Podcasts. I'm on Spotify, Amazon Music. I'm on YouTube, obviously, iHeartRadio, Podchaser, Pocket Cast, Player FM. Man, I haven't even listened to some of these streaming platforms. But yeah, Good Pods, True Fans, Castro, Overcast. Hey man, we are everywhere. So please feel free to drop me a line at drjermg@coolmeanderings.com. All right. Well, thanks so much. And until next time, have a great one. This is the Cool Meanderings podcast with Dr. Jerm G.